Tomorrow marks the World Day of Prayer, Reflection, and Action Against Human Trafficking. Catholics across the globe are encouraged to remember and pray for all those affected by human trafficking. The observation coincides with the feast day of St. Josephine Bakhita. St. Josephine was kidnapped as a child and sold into slavery in Sudan and Italy. She won her freedom with the help of the Canossian sisters in Venice and became a Canossian nun herself. St. Josephine Bakhita dedicated her life to sharing her testament of deliverance from slavery and comforting the poor and suffering. And joining me now is Dr. Hilary Chester, Associate Director of Anti-Trafficking Programs at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Dr. Chester, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first off, let's talk about St. Josephine. Can you talk a little bit about her and, of course, the significance of tomorrow?
Sure. I think she's a really wonderful example for the Catholic Church to look to someone to really epitomize the spirit of survivors of slavery or bondage or exploitation. As you noted in the introduction, she was sold into slavery as a child, ultimately ended up working for a diplomatic family from Italy. And when she was back in Italy with them, she began spending time with Canossian sisters and learned about the Gospels and really came to understand that as a child of God, as a person in the image of God, that she couldn't be enslaved. So she really asserted her own sense of self-worth and dignity. And I think that's just a really strong example for survivors that certainly we need to be looking out and trying to assist brothers and sisters that are enslaved, but they also can really assert themselves. And I think that's what she really epitomizes that.
Yeah, and human trafficking affects just about every community. Can we talk about that? A lot of people think sometimes it's just sex trafficking, but that's not the only way people are exploited.
Exactly. In fact, worldwide, probably a greater number of people are being exploited in the labor sector or in what we call labor trafficking or forced labor. There's a lot of trafficking that happens in industries that are either poorly regulated or unregulated. So when you think about people working in other people's homes, people working kind of in the back of restaurants, or people working where they're being put out on fishing boats and they're at sea for months, maybe even years at a time, and they just don't have contact, and no one's really kind of looking out for the welfare of workers in those kind of situations. And so there's a lot of exploitation that can happen there. People can be in debt bondage where they paid for recruitment fees and to get a job that they thought was going to be legitimate. But then they're just being sort of nickeled and dimed and just losing money at every turn. And so it can be really insidious in that way, or it can just be very overt where people really are being essentially almost bought and sold, and then they're being forced to work for absolutely no compensation. So it's really the whole array.
Yeah, can you give us a sense of how many people worldwide are impacted by it?
It's a difficult number. The International Labor Organization sort of grapples with this number worldwide, and some other international organizations as well. We think it could be as high as 38 million, and that would include men, women, children in sexual exploitation, in the commercial sex industry against their will, and then also people in all different kinds of employment sectors and work sectors, as well as things like forced marriages, which are like contracted brokered marriages, and then the women, in most cases, that are exploited in those kind of situations are really not treated as a spouse at all, but really as sort of like a worker in the home. And so when you kind of put all those numbers together, it can be as high as 38 million.
Pope Francis has described human trafficking as, quote, a wound against contemporary society. I know you've worked with folks who've been trafficked before. What have they said about it?
I mean, I think survivors and, who are aware of Pope Francis recognize him as being especially passionate about this issue, and they're really grateful for the amount of attention that he brings to the issue, how often he brings people together to really encourage them to work on the issue. But I think they also recognize that that other, quotations from Pope Francis where he talks about, people on the margins and disposable people, and us just having a culture of throwaway people. And I think that really resonates with survivors, because I think they definitely felt like they were already vulnerable when they were then taken advantage of. And I think, they look to us who are not in these situations to be better stewards and to look out and think about how our choices around what we're consuming, how we're behaving, what we're doing may play into that. And I think I think that's where the wound comes in, that, it's not just the traffickers who are, terrible people, but all of us that are benefiting in very direct or indirect ways. We're also kind of, digging into that wound a bit.
Yeah, Dr. Chester, thank you so much for your insight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your interest. We really appreciate it, and we're happy that people are interested in the topic.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Sure.